A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
Deep beneath a cave in southern Oregon, archaeologists uncovered something that shouldn't have existed. When scientists tested it, the results seemed impossible. They repeated the analysis with different samples and different equipment, expecting an error. Instead, every test revealed the same shocking truth. Humans had been living in North America thousands of years earlier than history claimed. And what Oregon uncovered didn't just challenge the accepted timeline, it completely changed it. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe, because the evidence you're about to see only gets more unbelievable. The discovery came from the Paisley Caves, a series of dry rock shelters in south-central Oregon. Although researchers had known about the site for decades, no one had excavated deep enough to uncover its oldest secrets. When a University of Oregon team finally dug into the lower layers, they didn't find weapons or ancient tools. They found preserved human waste. It may sound ordinary, but Oregon's dry desert climate had protected it for over 14,000 years. Inside was something no stone artifact could ever provide: human DNA. The genetic evidence matched Native American founding lineages, proving these people were direct ancestors of indigenous communities living today. This wasn't just an ancient relic. It was living evidence connecting modern people to one of the oldest known human occupations in the Americas. Scientists then dated the sample using accelerator mass spectrometry, a method that measures the organic material itself instead of the surrounding soil, making the results far more reliable. The final age came back at more than 14,000 years old, over 1,000 years earlier than the Clovis culture, long believed to be the first people in North America. For decades, the Clovis first theory dominated archaeology. According to that idea, humans entered the continent around 13,000 years ago by crossing the Bering Land Bridge and moving south through an ice-free corridor. But the evidence from Paisley Caves told a very different story. The first Americans weren't who history said they were. Entire careers had been built around the Clovis first model. Museums organized their exhibits around it. Generations of students learned it as established fact. Questioning those dates wasn't merely challenging a timeline. It meant telling many respected experts that the story they had defended for decades was no longer supported by the evidence. Oregon had just opened a gap of nearly 1,000 years between the Clovis culture and what the evidence was beginning to reveal. The Clovis people were no longer the earliest known Americans. In fact, they weren't even close, and Oregon's biggest surprise was still waiting beneath the surface. A single discovery from one cave is easy for skeptics to dismiss. Critics can blame contamination, faulty testing, or call it nothing more than an unusual coincidence. Archaeology has seen controversial finds brushed aside before. But about 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, another Oregon site was preparing to deliver evidence that pushed the timeline even further back. This wasn't another isolated anomaly. It was the beginning of a pattern, and patterns have a way of overturning long-held beliefs. If this story has already changed the way you think about history, make sure you subscribe, because what researchers uncovered just 70 miles away raises an even bigger question. The debate was no longer simply about when people first arrived. Now it was becoming about who they were. Welcome to Rimrock Draw. Roughly 70 miles from the Paisley Caves, near the small community of Riley in Oregon's Harney County, lies an unassuming place called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Since 2011, University of Oregon archaeologist Dr. Patrick O'Grady has spent season after season excavating this quiet site. If you've ever imagined archaeology as a series of spectacular discoveries, Rimrock Draw tells a very different story. For years, The excavation produced almost nothing remarkable. A few flakes of obsidian, a weathered ground stone tool resting near the shelter's entrance. Mostly it was endless hours spent kneeling in the dirt, brushing away dust and carefully sifting soil, patient work that rarely attracts cameras or headlines. Field season followed field season, with no promise that the effort would ever pay off. Unlike Paisley, Rimrock Draw didn't immediately offer ancient DNA. Instead, it offered something just as valuable: a timeline. Buried within the sediment was a thin layer of pale volcanic ash. Scientists identified it as ash from a well-documented eruption of Mount St. Helens that occurred roughly 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That layer became the site's unmistakable marker. Anything buried beneath it had to be older. Anything above it had to be younger. There was no room for rearranging the sequence, no debating disturbed soil. Thousands of years earlier, a volcano hundreds of miles away had blanketed the landscape with ash, creating a natural timestamp that sealed the ground beneath it. Everything trapped below that layer had remained untouched since before the eruption. That's exactly why Rimrock Draw became such an important companion to Paisley Caves. Paisley provided ancient DNA and an astonishing date, findings that critics could attempt to question by suggesting contamination or movement through the soil. But volcanic ash tells a much harder story to dispute. It's a geological event that leaves an unmistakable signature. No one can manufacture it. Anything lying beneath that ash must predate the eruption. There are no exceptions. So when Dr. O'Grady's team began uncovering artifacts below that layer, they weren't asking anyone to trust their interpretation. They were asking them to trust the volcano itself. Then the discoveries began. Carefully sifted from the soil came 27 tiny fragments of tooth enamel. Each one added another piece to the puzzle. One belonged to an extinct Ice Age camel that once roamed North America before disappearing thousands of years ago. Another came from Bison antiquus, the massive ancestor of today's American bison. These weren't remains from recent wildlife. They belonged to a lost ecosystem filled with giant Ice Age mammals that vanished long ago. Even more remarkable, these ancient animals were preserved beneath the same volcanic ash layer where human-made tools would soon appear. Suddenly, the landscape of ancient Oregon came into focus. Instead of the dry desert seen today, imagine enormous camels crossing open plains while giant bison grazed nearby, and somewhere among those animals walked a human carrying carefully crafted stone tools. Then, archaeologists uncovered one of them. Fashioned from brilliant orange chalcedony, a smooth glass-like variety of agate, the artifact wasn't designed for a single task. It featured a curved blade for slicing, a flat edge for scraping, and a serrated section that functioned almost like a saw. Dr. O'Grady compared it to an ancient Swiss army knife, a single tool capable of handling many different jobs. But its most fascinating feature wasn't its shape. It was the wear. The tiny teeth along the serrated edge had been polished smooth through repeated use. That kind of shine doesn't appear after a few days or even a few months. It develops only after years of constant handling. Someone relied on this tool again and again. They sharpened it, used it, sharpened it once more. It cut, scraped, and sawed through countless daily tasks until one day it was left behind inside the shelter. For reasons history will never reveal, its owner never returned. At that moment, the artifact stopped being just another stone object. It became something deeply personal. This wasn't merely a prehistoric tool. It was someone's trusted companion, the object they reached for every day, worn smooth by the same repeated motions that polish the handle of a favorite knife, or the edges of keys carried in a pocket today. That's the remarkable intimacy of rimrock draw. Across thousands of years, one ordinary object still carries the unmistakable imprint of the person who once depended on it every single day. Even after nearly 20,000 years, the worn surface of a stone blade still reveals the daily routine of the person who once carried it. Here's why that matters. The tool was discovered about 10 centimeters below the layer containing camel teeth. In archaeology, deeper layers are older, meaning the tool had been buried before those animals. When scientists radiocarbon dated the camel and bison teeth, the results pointed to an astonishing age, around 21,000 to 22,000 years old. Dr. Patrick O'Grady was skeptical. He ordered the tests again. The second analysis produced the same dates. 2 different samples, 2 separate tests, 1 identical conclusion. Instead of disproving the first result, the new evidence confirmed it. O'Grady later admitted that holding evidence this ancient was intimidating. Extraordinary discoveries can reshape careers, but if they're wrong, they can destroy them. He had seen. That happened before. Now the evidence left little room for doubt. The Ice Age animals had lived more than 18,000 years ago, and beneath them rested a human-made tool that was even older. Even more surprising, it wasn't a Clovis artifact. Its design matched the Western stem tradition, a completely different style with slender blades and rounded bases that predates Clovis by thousands of years. That detail changed everything. If this technology existed before Clovis, then it couldn't have evolved from Clovis. It pointed to an entirely different group of people with their own methods of making tools and their own history on the continent. By now, Oregon had produced 2 separate sites, 2 independent dating methods, and 1 unavoidable conclusion. Humans were present long before the timeline found in most textbooks. But if people had reached Oregon this early, an even bigger mystery emerged. How did they get here? The answer may have started appearing decades earlier, far from Oregon. Long before Paisley Caves made headlines, another site had already challenged the accepted story. That place was Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in western Pennsylvania. In 1955, local historian Albert Miller discovered unusual artifacts after investigating a groundhog burrow on the property. Years later, archaeologist Dr. Jim Adovasio began a careful excavation. With every layer removed, signs of human occupation continued deeper into the ground than anyone expected. Radiocarbon dating eventually placed people at Meadowcroft between roughly 16,000 and 19,000 years ago, well before Clovis. When Adovasio published the findings in 1980, he openly argued that the Clovis first theory could no longer explain the evidence. The reaction was swift. Critics questioned the dates, suggested contamination, and many simply ignored the discovery altogether. The resistance became so widespread that researchers eventually coined a name for it: Clovis primacy syndrome, the determination to defend the Clovis first model even as new evidence continued to challenge it. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Normally, once enough evidence builds up, scientific debates begin to settle. But this one refused to disappear. Even decades later, surveys of archaeologists showed that only about 38% accepted Jim Adovasio's Meadowcroft dates. Another 38% remained undecided, while the rest rejected them completely. Think about that. After more than 40 years, fewer than half of experts agree with findings that have repeatedly survived scrutiny. The issue isn't simply the evidence, it's that accepting it forces decades of accepted history to be rewritten. By the time discoveries from Oregon emerged, the field was already divided. Adovasio had challenged the Clovis first model years earlier, often standing alone. Oregon didn't start the debate, it strengthened it, providing another independent line of evidence pointing in the same direction. Once the timeline began to crack, an even bigger mystery appeared, about 700 miles south of Oregon. In the brilliant white sands of southern New Mexico, researchers uncovered something impossible to ignore. Not stone tools, not bones, footprints, 61 of them. Inside White Sands National Park, preserved in the ancient shoreline of Lake Otero, were human footprints frozen in time. Some belonged to adults, others to children. Every toe, every arch, every step remained visible after thousands of years. Unlike artifacts, footprints capture a living moment. Families walked across soft mud beside an Ice Age lake, never imagining their steps would survive for tens of thousands of years. You aren't just looking at evidence, you're standing where they once stood. The first radiocarbon dates, published in 2021, using ancient grass seeds buried with the tracks, suggested an astonishing age of 21,000 to 23,000 years. Critics argued the seeds might have absorbed old carbon from groundwater, making them appear older than they really were. So researchers tested a completely different material, ancient conifer pollen. The results matched. Later, a third study examined organic matter preserved in lake sediments. Once again, the dates fell into the same range, between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. 3 separate dating methods, 3 independent confirmations, 1 conclusion. Humans were walking North America during the height of the last ice age. The footprints tell an even richer story. Alongside the human tracks are the footprints of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, massive ice age animals that disappeared thousands of years ago. Humans and extinct megafauna crossed the same muddy shoreline at nearly the same moment, leaving behind a scene preserved like a snapshot from deep time. This is what the discoveries in Oregon ultimately changed. Once Paisley Caves and Rimrock Draw pushed human history further back, sites like White Sands no longer looked like isolated anomalies. They became part of a growing pattern. Entire families were living in North America long before the ice-free corridor was believed to exist. But even White Sands has its limits. Its story reaches back roughly 23,000 years. The next discovery stretches even further into the past. Ironically, archaeologists weren't even searching for it. Construction crews building a freeway in Southern California found it by accident. A freeway construction crew in Southern California wasn't searching for history. They were simply building a road when heavy machinery struck a massive bone. The project stopped immediately. Experts soon identified the remains as a mastodon, an elephant-like Ice Age animal. But as paleontologists uncovered more of the skeleton, they noticed something unusual. The bones weren't naturally broken. They carried spiral fractures, the kind that form only when fresh bone is deliberately smashed to extract nutrient-rich marrow. Nearby lay several large stone cobbles that didn't belong there naturally. Geological studies showed they had been carried in by hand and used as hammerstones and anvils. Then came the shocking part. Uranium-thorium dating consistently placed the site at around 130,700 years old. That age was staggering, over 5 times older than the 23,000-year-old White Sands footprints and far beyond the accepted timeline for humans in the Americas. When the findings were published in 2017, they sparked immediate controversy. The researchers cautiously suggested that some type of human ancestor may have been present in North America more than 130,000 years ago, not necessarily modern humans, not Neanderthals. Perhaps another, still unknown branch of the human family. Many archaeologists remain skeptical, not because the evidence has been conclusively disproven, but because the implications would completely reshape human history. If Oregon showed that people lived in North America long before Clovis, the California Mastodon site raises an even more unsettling possibility that human relatives may have reached the continent over 100,000 years earlier. That brings us back to the biggest mystery of all. How did they get here? For generations, the standard answer was simple: Beringia, the land bridge connecting Siberia and Alaska during the Ice Age. According to the traditional model, the first Americans crossed this route and spread south through an ice-free corridor. But discoveries like Oregon's Western stem tools don't fit that story. Their technology is completely different from Clovis, suggesting they may have arrived by another route altogether. And one remarkable place hints that ancient humans were capable of far more than we once believed. The island of Crete has been separated from the mainland for roughly 5 million years, yet evidence suggests early humans somehow reached it anyway, proving that crossing open water may have happened much earlier than once imagined. For years, experts believed ancient humans couldn't cross open seas, but the island of Crete tells a different story. Crete has been isolated from the mainland for nearly 5 million years, meaning no one could have walked there. Yet archaeologists discovered stone tools dating between 130,000 and 700,000 years old, likely made by early human ancestors such as Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. The only way they could have reached the island was by boat. That single discovery challenged one of archaeology's biggest assumptions, that early humans lacked the technology to travel across open water. If they could sail the Mediterranean that long ago, reaching new continents by sea suddenly became far more believable. Genetic research adds another piece to the puzzle. Studies of the mitochondrial lineage D4H suggest there were two separate migrations into the Americas. The first, around 26,000 years ago, likely followed the Pacific coastline by boat, moving gradually from northern China through Japan and into the Americas. A second migration, about 15,000 years ago, crossed the Bering Land Bridge and became associated with the Clovis culture. That changes everything. The Clovis people may not have been the first Americans. They may have been later arrivals entering a continent already inhabited. Stone tools support the idea. Similar tool-making traditions appear across China, Japan, and Western North America, including Oregon's Western stem tradition, suggesting a shared technological heritage rather than coincidence. When all the discoveries are viewed together, the picture becomes difficult to ignore. The Paisley Caves, Rimrock Draw, White Sands, the Sharuti Mastodon site, each points toward the same conclusion. Human history in the Americas began much earlier and followed a far more complex path than the traditional story ever suggested. In many ways, it all circles back to Oregon. Those quiet caves and desert shelters produced evidence that forced archaeologists to rethink one of history's oldest assumptions. And somewhere beneath untouched ground, the next discovery may already be waiting. So who broke the mastodon bones in California more than 130,000 years ago? For now, no one has the answer. If you enjoyed this journey into one of archaeology's greatest mysteries, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for the next discovery that could rewrite history once again.